It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Humanities, as Jeff said. I teach at the law school, and a lot of my writing focuses around law, technology, and music, individually and together. I want to introduce our panelists. We're going to try to have things move quickly because we know it's late, and we know that we think people will have a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is briefly introduce each panelist. Each panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we're going to have some cross-panel discussion, and then we hope to open it up for questions. And we're going to go in seated order, which is not the same as alphabetical order. So first, on my left, I have Jonathan Taplin. He's director emeritus. Well, he actually was an M&A banker at Merrill Lynch, he just told me, which is not in his bio, which is quite interesting. He's director emeritus at the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC. He was a professor at Annenberg from 2003 to 2016, and he specializes in international communication management and digital media entertainment. Next to him, I have Paul Dourish, who's Chancellor's Professor here in the School of Informatics, and he's Associate Dean for Research at the Donald Brand School of Information Computer Sciences. He focuses on understanding information technology as a site of social and cultural production. Next, I have Debri Chachra, excuse my pronunciation. She's a professor at the Olin College of Engineering, and she works on improving undergraduate engineering and education. And she writes a regular column, Reinvention, for the American Society for Engineering Education's Prism magazine. Her interests include gender and engineering, infrastructure, biological materials, including a type of plastic made by bees. I'd love to hear more about that. And last, farthest away from me, I have Craig Calhoun, who's president of the Berggruen Institute. And prior to that, he was director and president of LS, London School of Economics and Political Science, where he's still a political centennial professor. He was president of the Social Science Research Council prior to that, and a university professor of political science at NYU. And he's the author of a number of books and former editor of 2 scholarly journals, and is a fellow of the British Academy. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
So I'm going to start, just give you some facts that might ground this discussion. Fumi didn't tell you, but I actually older than most people in this room. I'm 71, and so in '68 I was working for Bob Dylan, and I happened to spend some time with these characters, which are Stuart Brand and Ken Kesey, who were in the evening throwing mass acid trips, and in the daytime they were building one of the first electronic networks called the Whole Earth Electronic Link. And so the internet was really a very countercultural idea. It got distorted in the late 80s, as our speaker last night said, by a group of libertarians led by Peter Thiel, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, who believed in Ayn Rand's theories. Peter Thiel says, I no longer believe that capitalism and democracy are compatible. Thiel built the first one of these companies called PayPal. And the idea was that if you could create a sector was outside the realm of government control, in the ideal way, you could put your business on a platform in the middle of the ocean called a seastead, but that didn't work out so well because nobody wanted to go live in the middle of the ocean. But essentially, then you could have an unregulated business. And so the idea was no regulations, no taxes. Amazon doesn't have to pay sales taxes, can put 4,000 bookstores out of business because they have to pay 8% sales tax. No copyright. YouTube says to the music business, your content's going to be on YouTube whether you want it to or not. You have to decide you want a little of our advertising money or not. And no competition. Because basically the internet would be a winner-takes-all business. And so Thiel made the bold assertion in the early 90s that Silicon Valley was going to be the center of the universe and that there would be a very few firms that would dominate it. He turned out to be totally right. 10 years ago, the largest companies in the world were ExxonMobil, General Electric. Today, the largest companies in the world are Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. They're globally totally dominant. You can see Facebook compared to every other social network. You can see Google has 90% market share in search advertising. Its closest competitor has 3%. Amazon has 75% of the books business. And last year, Facebook and Google took 88% of every advertising dollar online. What happened to the people in this room, the working journalists? Their revenues fell by 80%. There are 50% fewer people working as professional journalists today than there were 20 years ago. But I'm more concerned about the effect of this gigantic wealth creation. It doesn't escape you that the 10 largest fortunes in America, with the exception of the Koch brothers, are all tech fortunes. And what happened was that at the beginning of the tech boom here, the 0.1%, that is 1/10 of 1%, their wealth skyrocketed to a place that today it is as much as the wealth of the bottom 90% of the country. And what worries me the most is, and I'm going to use a word that I've only heard used once in the last 2 days, which is the word class. We are creating a new class. At the top, obviously, we've always had a ruling class and what Burnham called the managerial elite, which work for the ruling class but still make a shitload of money. And then we've essentially eliminated the middle class. And so now we have below that a working class, an industrial working class, and the working class still has unions and still has health care. The industrial working class still is making Teslas and other things, and obviously the gigantic service working class does everything from write software to be in hospitals or whatever. Below that, we have a new class, which economists are calling the precariat. The precariat are all freelancers. Some of them are adjunct professors. Some of them write software. Some of them design websites, and they're lucky enough to be above the API, that is, above the application program interface. They tell computers what to do. But an increasingly large number of students from colleges as good as USC live in the precariat below the API. That is, they are told by computers what to do. That is, the person that works in the Amazon warehouse, the person that drives for Uber, they're not doing anything to build skill set. They're simply following the directions of the computer. And that is a one-way trip to nowhere. And then, of course, what we've always had, the underclass, the opiate and all of that. Now, one of the things that concerns me the most is that these companies, Facebook and Google especially, have distorted our democracy. I just want to point out one thing. Until May of 2016, Facebook had humans curating the trending topics. And then, because Breitbart and Fox News pounded on them for months, they removed the humans. And this is the day they did it. And that's where fake news went crazy. Because after that point, you could write, the Pope endorses Donald Trump, and the computer doesn't know that's not true. And if you hit it with 50,000 bots or 200,000 bots, you could force it to the top of the trending topics, you could force it to the top of the Google search algorithm, and it would win. Now, I'm not so much concerned about whether the Russians did this or anybody else, because obviously a lot of evidence shows that the Trump campaign used Facebook's internal people in their operation to help them target it. So they could launch to only African Americans a post like this, which says, Hillary says you're a super predator. That's an actual post from the campaign. And of course, that, needless to say, is voting suppressing. So I'm going to just stop with one last thing. These people call themselves libertarians. Is the fact that the average teenager spends 2 hours and 25 minutes a day on Facebook and checks their phone 254 times a day, a free person. I would argue that is an addicted person. And there's a great deal of interest in the tech community to say that we have built these, as this book proves, the whole idea is to build addictive applications. So I'm going to just leave it at that, and then we can go from there. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. I was at a conference last year and ran into a friend of mine who I'd worked with at Apple, and this was back in '96 when Apple was nothing like what Apple is now. And he was doing his research at that time on early community, online communities, organizing on the internet, chat rooms and things like this, and had devoted much of his professional career to the idea that if we could just talk to each other, we would all get on better. He was not a happy fellow and had decided to retire. When at that point, back at, in the early days of the sort of widespread public internet in the early 1990s, I think most of the scholarly perspective was there were one of two views. Most people held one of two views about what it was likely to happen and what the internet portended for how it was that community would work. One, a sort of like the production of online of some kind of Habermasian public sphere in which we would all be able to hash out the issues of the day and form collective opinions, and another of massive siloization and the way we would just seek out perspectives similar to our own and talk purely to other people who already shared our views. And I think even despite the rhetoric of bubbles and echo chambers, we could conclude now that neither of these views was correct. We're actually remarkably cognizant of the other side's point of view. It circulates rather hatefully a lot of the time. We're not quite as siloed as we might like to imagine. And one of the reasons one of the things I want to point to when we talk about the internet, we talk about technology, we talk about social media, is that they don't operate on their own. I don't follow Donald Trump's Twitter account myself, but I pretty much know everything he tweets because I also read it on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post and various other newspapers. And so when I want to think about the internet and technology here with respect to public discourse and democracy, I think it's important to recognize that social media forms one part of what Andrew Chadwick calls the hybrid media system. That is, that we can't see the effects of technology independently of the effects of the other forms of mediation, communication, and discourse within which we're embedded. That's not to say that they look all the same or that they look all the same to all of us. One of the pieces of work I go back to in my teaching a lot is Arjun Appadurai notion of scapes and mediascapes. So rather like the landscape that like wherever you sit, you see a particular arrangement of objects, buildings, trees, hills that would look those same objects would look quite different if seen from a slightly different place. Similarly, there's a set of media with which I engage and a set of media with which you engage, and yet we all engage with them in slightly different ways, slightly different kinds of balances. The way I always like to explain to my students, every tweet is public and seen by, or can be seen by all, and yet nobody's Twitter feed looks the same as mine because nobody's seeing exactly the same set of things in exactly the same ways. So I think we have to sort of look at these things more systemically. There are also two features of our contemporary media landscape that are, especially online, that are, I think, significantly different or significantly different than was anticipated by people who subscribed either to the Habermasian public sphere model or to the siloed communication model. And the first is the influence of algorithms and algorithmic processing. And again, this also embodies a duality. When I was an undergraduate computer science student long ago, an algorithm, to know an algorithm was to know something definitively. It was to have a procedure, a definite procedure by which we could go from a one state or an unknown state to a known state. I've got an algorithm for sorting numbers, and I know what that's going to look like after I've run the algorithm. The algorithmic now means the opposite of that, essentially. It means probabilistic and unknown. When your credit card is declined and you call up to complain and they say, well, the algorithm just said there was something dodgy about that purchase. It's a way in which people are deflecting and saying, nah, I don't know. Yep. Similarly, when the Occupy Wall Street movement complained to Twitter that they were being censored because Occupy Wall Street never became a trending topic on Twitter at the same time as Justin Bieber's haircut did, the Twitter people could validly say, yeah, we've got no idea why something's a trending topic. We wrote the code. There's an algorithm. We don't know why it does what it does. So algorithmic is actually is not necessarily a definitive thing. And then the second thing, of course, which is related to it, is that this is an advertising-supported world. And if you're at Twitter and you're at Facebook and you're at Google, you're not in the tech industry, you're in the advertising industry. A thing I occasionally say to my friends who go work for Google, it doesn't make me any friends. Now, this week, John Perry Barlow died this week. Lyricist for the Grateful Dead, Wyoming cattle rancher, one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and one of the people responsible for certain kinds of rhetoric about freedom online and freedom in the internet. As various people have noted, if he had focused on justice online and justice on the internet, we might be living in a different kind of world. But I am struck by the fact that this is a freedom that was, freedom through advertising is not a phrase around which any major, social movement has ever coalesced. So the only thing worse than that actually is justice through advertising. So make of that what you will. The one thing then within those advertising media, those advertising corporations that has completely disappeared, and that I hope people are beginning to pay attention to, is the sort of journalistic responsibility that comes along with the kinds of circulation of discourse that they are responsible for. That may be something that we can sort of talk more about. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you for the invitation. So our sort of the briefing that we were given by FUNMI was around the idea of these new technologies that are changing the world and how we interact with it and what that means for our identity. And in fact, what I'm probably going to spend most of my time talking about, and I think Craig is also going to talk about, is some not very new technologies that we don't spend a lot of time on. And one of the ways I sort of think about this is that if we're thinking about how we collectively interact with technology, and if we're thinking about how that shapes our identity, then to some extent social media is the form in which we do it, and I'm interested in some of the reasons, the things that we need to do it for. So the first thing I need to start with is that I'm actually a cuckoo. I'm Canadian. And so only if I say about or I'm sorry is it clear that I'm an immigrant. I've only actually had my U.S. citizenship. I have dual citizenship for, I actually had it for just about a couple of months before Amy invited me to come speak on American identity. Although I would point out that, as it was also brought up in our previous panel, one of the things about growing up in Canada is that you actually end up growing up with a fairly nuanced view of American identity. Not for nothing did Margaret Atwood call it the U.S.-Canada border as the world's longest one-way mirror. But the other piece of it, of course, is that it meant that I spent basically all of my adult life in about equal parts in both countries, in two large, geographically, culturally diverse countries that were really grappling with what their identity is. So these, as was also pointed out in the last panel, it is not a unique thing for countries to be asking themselves who they are, and I think that's especially true for these countries that were settled in North America and Australia. They don't have sort of 1,000 years of continuous history. They have the discontinuity of settlement. So one of the things about being Canadian is that in addition to sort of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a catchphrase, I grew up with peace, order, and good government. And I kind of realized, I was talking to another friend of mine today who's also a Canadian living in the United States, about how much that kind of shapes how I see the world and how in particular I see how we interact with technology. So there's a quote by Douglas Adams, a science fiction writer, that I really love, and I have to dig up the exact quote, but the basic idea is that we don't think of anything as technology if it existed before we were a teenager. And so that basically, if it came out while we were a teenager, it's new and it's cool, you could probably get a job doing it. If it comes out before you're a teenager, it's always existed. And it's only technology if it came out after you're in your 20s. And so this sort of implicitly has a model of tech that's the model of technology that we've been talking about, which is this sort of individualistic model of text, this idea of it's new, the idea that it's created de novo by these people, and we saw from Jonathan's graph of inequality that the benefits of creating it accrue to the creators, right? That they deserve it, that they created it. And in fact, actually, I'd refer you to Mariana Mazzucato's deconstruction of the iPhone, right? And how much it's based on publicly funded research. So when I'm thinking about democracy and technology, publicly funded research is actually high in the list of things that I think about, right? It's like, how do we interact with that kind of technology in a democracy? I'm also really interested in things like socio-technical systems. So that would be GPS, it would be NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that does weather forecasting. It does the Department of Energy, which is actually what handles sort of all the nuclear and everything sort of related to nuclear power and nuclear weaponry and safely for a long time. The Centers for Disease Control, right? All of these large socio-technical systems that are used to keep 300 million people in a globally connected world safe. And the last piece of that is infrastructure. It's the physical infrastructure of the world that we live in, which is something that is sort of the ultimate in technology for democracy, right? It is explicitly designed to reach and to unite all of us, and it actually kind of underpins our identity. And these systems are not nice to have. These systems are not things that people choose to walk away from, with very, very few exceptions. They fill at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So clean water, electricity, so power, access to fuel for heating and cooking, but also, and these days, of course, telecommunications and sewage. So we collectively, basically, because these things are so fundamental, when we collectively abrogate those responsibilities, we get things like interstate bridges collapsing over the Mississippi, right? These are sort of serious, unmissable problems. And we also get things like the shameful amount of time it took Flint to get clean water. And of course, if anyone's following the news in the slightest bit, the 400,000 Americans in Puerto Rico that do not have electricity. And my thesis is that this is actually an important part of an American identity, and one of the pieces of evidence for that is that we say there's 400,000 Americans in Puerto Rico who don't have electricity, right? That this is sort of unconscionable to us because they have access to what we have. And you can date that back to the Rural Electrification Act, where there's a political decision made to do this. You can see echoes of this so about a year and a half ago, Canada put in a new law about broadband, that everybody, regardless of where they live, need to have access to broadband, which in a country as geographically dispersed or population dispersed as Canada is even more significant undertaking than the Rural Electrification Act. Cape Town, if people are following Cape Town, which is a few weeks out from day zero, the right to clean water is in fact in the South African Constitution. So these are sort of political choices that are made collectively. One of the reasons why I care about this now, and one of the reasons why I care about social media as a way into it, is because we are not doing a very good job of maintaining what we have, but also we're kind of at the point where we need to start actively engaging with our technologies collectively. And we're just not actually that good at it, right? We're very good at engaging with our technology as individuals. So if we're trying to think about, okay, well, if we want infrastructure for everyone, we want it to be resilient, we want it to be sustainable, which means we need to think about decarbonization, we want it to be equitable, we need to start being able to have civic conversations, and we need to recognize that these are tied to our identity. And the sort of simple, obvious case of that is thinking about electricity. There's the technical side, which is things like wind farms and batteries and solar power. There's the component of that is upgrading the electrical grid. But all of that is really dependent on policies, on regulations, how we roll them out, and crucially, the question of who benefits from those technologies. And these are not, Fumi said my background's in engineering, I teach engineering students, and I'm working on rethinking how we teach engineering students. But these are not questions for technologists, right? These are questions for all of us. Part of the reason why I'm here today is to talk to you about the technology piece. When I talk to my students, it's actually talking to them about the policy and the regulation piece, right? About thinking beyond being an engineer. So one of the other things about growing up in Canada is that I got exposed to Ursula Franklin early. So if there's one thing that you get out of me being here on this panel, it's actually to encourage you to read or listen to her Real World of Technology lectures. So Ursula Franklin gave a series of lectures that were broadcast across Canada on the Canadian Public Broadcasting Station called The Real World of Technology in 1989. And they're actually still, so speaking of infrastructures, they're still available on the CBC website to be downloaded to listen to the audio, but they also exist as books. But she really those are really about how do we actively begin to wrestle with this question of how do we address technology as a democracy. And in fact, the name of the lectures, The Real World of Technology, plays on an earlier lecture series called The Real World of Democracy. So I think, mostly I think that I want to not just talk about Facebook, but how our identity is bound up with our shared infrastructure, about how we need to make decisions about it collectively, and then the role of sort of social media in facilitating or undermining that ability that we have. So putting my flag for the panel in that field, but I think it'll be picked up.
Well, thanks to the organizers, as everyone said. As we get towards the end, fabulous 2 days. This has really been great. We're privileged to be a part of it. You'll see in my remarks connections to the other panelists, and as Debbie foreshadowed, especially what Debbie had to say. But here are some headlines, which, if the discussion goes that way, we can follow up and continue. Let me start by emphasizing something about not newness, but still having a history. So democracy's crisis didn't start with social media, and it didn't start with the election of Donald Trump, and it didn't start with even the somewhat similar events going on with the wave of populism around the world, so-called populism. It's been building since the 1970s, and the entwined technology issues and democratic crisis have these linked histories. Technologies are very powerful exacerbators of the problems in democracy, but not autonomous causes. And they have the impact they have entwined with political economy, social structure, and culture. So these things are going on together, but be cautious about just saying, oh, social media has brought us a crisis of democracy, or something that simple. A massive asymmetry of power and wealth is part of that crisis of democracy. The decay of institutions, and with them of trust, and the capacity to deliver goods, and especially public goods, is part of that crisis of democracy. The capacity of institutions to integrate people from different backgrounds in different places of different classes is part of that crisis of democracy. There's a technological thread running through each of those things, but it didn't have to be the case that in order to have the range of technologies from what were called microelectronics in the 1970s through to the IT industries of today, we had to do it with massive asymmetries of power, with massive destruction of institutions, with the crisis of trust that we have, or indeed with the decline of economic participation that we see in the United States that so undermines community life in many different places. So we have a story of globalization and of a kind of economic change. The deindustrialization, that was a big issue 2 generations ago, just keeps going on and getting subsumed into a recast story in various ways. But at least since the 1970s, we've had a series of changes building, and the current issues of the relationship between democracy and technology are in many ways embedded in this. Let me offer a silly factoid in that regard. Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan was "Let's make America great again." And in fact, Donald Trump's campaign paid a licensing fee to be able to reuse Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan, right? This isn't all new. Second theme, and here echoing Debbie very directly, lots of the impacts, not all of them, of the new, especially information technologies, but others too, are embedded in the creation of large-scale systems. The most important part of IT's impact is that, and even many of the things that change the prospects for employment have to do with that. That is, to imagine discrete robots replacing discrete workers is to miss the extent to which an integrated socio-technical system is making possible transformations in production and distribution, as well as other things. Indeed, infrastructure, and I share this interest with Debbie, makes modern life possible. But just think of urbanization. Urbanization is based on a cluster of technologies, of plumbing and waste removal, of power sources, of the ability to benefit from agriculture by transportation into cities to be able to distribute, by refrigeration, right? A whole story of a cluster of infrastructural technologies, communications, transportation, power, central among them, but it's a longer list. And this makes possible life as we know it in most of the world, although there are places that are in very different situations vis-a-vis technology. And certainly in the United States. But it doesn't make it possible just neutrally, right? We've built the infrastructures in particular ways, and they shape the social existence that we have, and they have consequences for us in lots of ways. Public investments have often been crucial to the building of these infrastructures, not just to ensuring that there is widespread access to the infrastructures, but to creating them. That doesn't mean that the public investments have always been matched by a concern for the public good of equal weight. So often there have been large public investments that make possible disproportionate private gains. The issue of publicly funded research and its commercialization since the 1970s, the IT industry is one example of this, but not the only one. And there are a variety of public investment decisions before us now, and a variety of questions that are also questions about who decides as we build these infrastructural systems, the net, but also autonomous vehicles, right? How does it get decided how they will be rolled out and deployed? Will they be autonomous public transportation systems designed to maximize access to life for the people who are least well off in our society, or will they be organized in a different way? Well, there's a decision to be made about that, not just a technology that makes things possible in all of this. Third theme, just being conscious of time, not wanting to go on too much about any one. Another area of technology that actually has connections to AI, but isn't, is the whole range of biotechnologies that are potentially engaging in shaping evolution and disrupting our very idea of nature. Gene editing, for example, but biomechanics and neural implants and various transformations of the biome and so forth. Without going into it at length, let me just note, A, there's a connection to the IT technology. B, these are technologies that potentially change us, human beings, in pretty fundamental ways. And C, there are real questions about how choices get made. Do parents own their children, and thus the right autonomously and unilaterally to alter their genetic makeup? What will it mean if we can't say that differences among people are natural, but they are created in this way? And if this is available entirely on the basis of the market, so that the allocation of who gets to decide that their children should be free from certain diseases or have enhanced capabilities is a market good bought and sold. And in this, as well as the IT industry generally, how the market is organized in a certain way, and that's a big issue too. There may be different regulations and different possibilities in China, which is the other major global leader in the development of gene editing technology as of AI these days. So the question of will democracies be able to facilitate informed decision-making on a collective level about the future that we shape with these technologies is very basic. Fourth theme, technological innovation itself is often understood very misleadingly as though it is just the unfolding of successful experiments and gradually realizing all the possibilities that a technology makes possible. So a commonplace understanding, a wrong one I'm saying, is there are possibilities and gradually we realize them, right? Of course possibilities have to be there, but what technology we develop is based on lots of other factors. It's based on curiosity and ideas sparked by science fiction novels, but it's also based on what people will invest in. And the organization of funding is based on what the government is investing in as well as private industry. So technological innovation itself is thought of poorly if it has the individualistic dimension that we also cited, but also if it has the idea of pure creativity somehow driving it rather than a shaping in which there are investments in some things, not others. It's thought of poorly if it is experienced as necessity as though technology just happens and then we have to develop. It's thought of poorly if we miss, I harken back to Jonathan's comments, the extent to which it is dominated by giant corporations. It's not just after the technology gets developed, it is the fact, the nature of innovation now, in which there is a huge role played by the giant corporations. There's an ideology of entrepreneurship, a myth about garages in Silicon Valley, but there's also a reality of some very large players that buy up technologies, partly to implement them, partly to prevent threats, and shape the course of technological innovation. Above all, I think we have to worry about what I called in my provocation essay, forgetting the social in this age, even when we think about social media, but how social much of this is, the pervasive individualism which is reinforced by the very ideologies of Silicon Valley, the libertarianism, the notion of meritocracy, and so forth. Fifth theme, I am getting to the end, and this one I'm going to be fast about. The media of democratic practice, the social media questions, all of that. Others have said it, I just want to endorse. This too isn't new. This is an evolution, right? Political parties began to use direct mail campaigns in ways in which they could target different audiences with different messages already in the 70s and so forth, issues of fakery, clickbait, commerce. Now, saying it's not all new doesn't mean it's not really powerful. It's hugely powerful, but it's powerful exacerbating things that were going on. And so there are a variety of issues in this. Sixth and penultimate theme, again, I will just mention, the military, artificial intelligence and weapons systems, right? What does this mean on several levels if the ability to observe, orient, decide, and act, the OODA loop that is discussed in the military, is increasingly mediated by AI? Well, it means a range of things, including extremely fast decisions, probably too fast for human intervention unless that is explicitly built in, and has to be built in not just asymmetrically. Oh, we've decided there should be human intervention, and so we will slow down our response to the launching of missiles? Unlikely, right? It's a complex international problem. But there is a basic issue about a transformation of warfare going on. It's also about ordinary soldiers and the idea of a democratic army. Are we going to deploy technology to enhance the abilities and the safety of soldiers? Or are we going to deploy it to bypass the need to rely on human individual soldiers, which has some good sides, like possibly fewer of them getting killed, right? But some potential issues in all of this. Finally, then back to the theme of the conference, who do we think we are? Well, in this, as in every other dimension, we need to think about multiple and overlapping we's. The idea that there is some singular we, thinking who we are, is problematic. On the other hand, right, the idea that we can ignore nations or other projects of trying to forge commonalities is problematic, because without it, democracy is in big, big trouble. Democracy depends in some part on being able to say we, in a strong sense, at some scale, and I'll suggest nations haven't become irrelevant, but also inside and cross-cutting. We see ourselves in technological mirrors, but we fail to see the ways in which technology shapes our lives here, like very basic questions of what does it mean to be human? How would changes in what it means to be human, say with gene editing, affect our ability to discern an equality among humans and therefore among citizens? And how is that equality already challenged by the radical class differences that Jonathan alluded to and that we all know about in this? I'm not arguing for a dystopian vision or a utopian vision. In fact, my last comment is I think that the discussion is distorted by having utopia and dystopia clashing with each other and missing all of the other things that are going on. It's not will AI replace us? It is how will AI be implicated in our lives, largely through infrastructures and systems which will reduce our ability to make choices about our lives.
So there's a lot of material we could talk about. We could be here for a couple of days, I think. I'm just going to highlight a few themes that I heard, and then I have a question for the panel, and then I'd like to break it open for questions so other people can have an input. There was a lot of discussion, I think, about various themes, including the old and the new, individual and collective, public and private, goals of technology, justice and freedom as sort of dominating goals, distributional consequences, how we see a success and failure, and how that weaves into our stories of creation and technology progress, because I think that's a big theme that we need to think about, because we tend to think about technology as being positive in progress, and technology is connected to progress. And I think that's a underlying assumption that needs to be challenged more. Also, questions of trust, I think, are important, commercial and non-commercial, and also thinking about modes of creation, and last but not least, regional, national, and global aspects of this, because I would argue, my research focuses on Africa, and I would argue that we see a lot of digital colonialism in the world, that in America is the new colonial power in the digital era. So I want to ask a question, because it strikes me that when we think about technology and other infrastructures that shape democracy and institutions, the first part of the question is, are we leaving these too much to technologists today? And number two is, are these questions too important to leave to technologists? And I say this, my husband's a software engineer, so I deal a lot with technology, people that come from the technology side. So it's a question I'm always asking myself.
So in my book, I use a term called technodeterminism. And it's the notion that, and I would go to two of Craig's issues. Who decides and what technologies do we develop? And the problem, as I see it, is that there's no political decision-making being made here as to where technology is going. Technology has been an unregulated space, and essentially the technologists are saying, this is the way the world's going, and if you don't get on the bus, you're going to be left behind. And so when I hear Mark Andreessen at a conference recently say to me, in 10 years, the long-haul trucking business will be totally automated. So I say to him, well, what are you going to do with the 5 million people who are in the long-haul trucking business? He says, that's not my problem. That's a politician's problem. But when you talk to Steve Mnuchin, he says, oh, the problems of automation and robotics and everything are 100 years in the future. It's not even on our radar. So one of those two people is wrong. I would argue that the Treasury Secretary is wrong, and that the politicians have no basic idea as to what's really going on here. And so if we just say, okay, we'll let Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos decide where our world is going, which is what we've essentially done for the last 30 years, we're going to end up in a situation where we don't have any decision making, and there is no political, and the whole idea that somehow we're having a conversation about this is just going to be an illusion. You know, while we're thinking about, you know, culture wars, they just passed a tax cut of a 1.5 trillion goes into their pockets, and a military budget of another 200 billion, and nobody said anything about it. You just bang, done. And we're here worrying about other things. You know, as you know, Bannon said, you can talk about cultural wars all you want. We love it. All it is a distraction so the plutocrats can end up doing exactly what they want to do.
Can I push back on one thing? Oh.
Yeah.
So is it correct to say that it's unregulated space? I'm thinking from a perspective of Lawrence Lessig. I mean, it's not regulated by the government, but there are forms of regulation, right, that might be occurring in that space that we need to pay attention to. Not because that's the way we should go, but it's not chaos, right? It's space that's just not regulated by the government.
No.
There are different forms of regulation.
It's unregulated by the government. If you say it's regulated by competition, what competition does Google have when it has 95% of the market?
Exactly.
What competition does Amazon have in the books business? It has none. You know, and when it did have a little competition, Apple, they got the government to sue them in antitrust court to get them out of the business. I mean, these people have no regulation. They do exactly what they want to do.
I think I want to. I'm thinking of all those moments I spent inside technical companies where the technologists don't actually, I think, feel a great sense of agency or control or decision making, right? They would distinguish between the technical decisions and business decisions. I mean, I think actually, Mark Andreessen, whether you want to count him as a technologist or a venture capitalist, I think I think it falls far more over here. And so there's that kind of interesting thing, and it goes very much to, for instance, the kinds of reformatory educational processes that Deb's enrolled in. I did want to say with respect to the regulation stuff. I mean, one of the things I think that you noted has come out of a number of different things that people have said is sort of thinking internationally about this stuff. One of the really interesting things going on right now, for instance, is with ICANN, the corporation that manages names and numbers and sort of network addresses and all that sort of stuff online. This is an activity that was originally sort of run by a non-profit, or actually just a bunch of volunteers in the US, became internationalized a number of years ago, and which the US is currently trying to claw back and make American again. Yes, with all the resonancies that phrase is meant to have. And so one of the fascinating things, given the kind of rhetoric of openness and the sort of cyberspace, or even, is just how often and in how many ways nation states rear their heads, international organizations manifest themselves once again, borders are erected online. And those questions of regulation are actually really important. As you say, they're not normally embedded within traditional government kind of organizations, and yet traditional governments are deeply entwined with organizations like ICANN and the other sort of places where some of this happens that we don't pay sort of enough attention to.
But ICANN is irrelevant to Google. They could care less. I mean, Vince serves on the board and he does whatever they tell him to do, but it's irrelevant.
So I want to actually go back to Finmi's point and the question that you sort of explicitly answered and you sort of implicitly answered, which is are technologists to blame for this? And you, I think, nailed it. And it's like, I think that you're overestimating how much agency technologists have. And in fact, you made that distinction yourself when you talked about plutocrats versus technologists, right? The problem is not that technologists are making the decisions. The problem is that plutocrats are making the decisions.
Technologists are plutocrats.
Of a technology background, right?
Right, and
so these are technologists who became plutocrats.
Right, although arguably it's precisely because of what you said earlier, which is that we've created a system where it's possible for the ultimate plutocrat are the people who came from technology. Right, which was not the case 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? So, but that doesn't, just because the plutocrats are technologists does not mean that the technologists are the people who are running the show, right? It means that we collectively have decided that we would let people with money run the show. Speaking of Lawrence Lessig, right? Thinking about campaign finance reform.
Well, I guess the question I have though, and this is that I think people from a training and education perspective, when I think of the colonialists during the colonial era, when I think of digital colonialists, they're very narrow in their training and orientation to a significant degree. They often are from a technical background. And if you look at, and there are two issues that I think you need to look at. One is demographics. Pardon me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
One is demographics, and it's fascinating to look at the number of women, the declining number of women in computer science as computer science became more important. And that's a fascinating demographic statistic. And then if you look at from the educational and training perspective, this sort of libertarian perspective is, I think, very closely connected to a technology mindset of, let just technology will sort of sort itself out, right? We don't need the government to sort these things out.
So I always use the Kim Stanley Robinson quote where he says that we have very carefully trained our young men and women of technology to be apolitical, which means that they're just putty in the hands of the rulers, right? And I think the change is who the rulers are. So I would argue that the technologists, especially not the people who are not the rulers, right? They're not the people who are actually making the decisions, but we haven't trained them to throw wrenches into those particular issues.
Yeah, but
they
Debbie,
are writing the algorithms.
But
Sorry?
Debbie,
They are writing the
Deb,
algorithms,
you said something really incredibly true, which is they are not totally in control. I mean, look at what happened on Facebook when Sheryl Sandberg says, I was shocked that someone would use our advertising tools to target anti-Semitic users.
Right.
Well, someone called it the Frankenstein problem.
Right.
So they built this incredibly
Yeah.
complex targeting system and they had no idea how it would be used.
Right.
Well, that's stupid.
And I actually think that was actually Paul's point about the sort of unknowableness of algorithms.
But they don't
And so-
want to know,
right.
do they, right? Because they could know if they wanted to.
Of course
Right,
they
they
knew
could,
what
they
it,
could.
of course they
Like,
could.
To be clear, like my professional career as an engineering educator is precisely about engineering students actually understanding the broader context of their work. that's not the point I'm arguing, right? The point that I'm arguing is that they are not the ones who are doing it because they have a political agency that they're trying to shape the world. They are doing it because they've been trained to be apolitical, and they're doing what their bosses and whoever holds the equity in the company is asking them to do, which is also a problem. But the problem is not that they're not implementing.
But apolitical is not neutral.
Correct.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
the problem,
Yeah.
right?
That is totally
Let me
a
jump
problem,
in and claim
right?
my 30 seconds of this. So, mostly agreeing.
Take
So,
the,
you know,
take the
we-
mic over there.
Are we leaving too much to the technologists? Well, yes, but even more to the techno-capitalists. But I insist on it. It's not just the business elites. It's not just wealth, because well, you know, the Larry Pages that all have a lot of agency that most of us don't have, deploy it in some sometimes harmful ways. Capitalism is also a system. And this is embedded in a system which has drivers that are not just the decisions of individuals in it. So I think we'll get it wrong if we think it's just them as agents. And the technologists, I accept the point. I think technologists are actually quite divided. I think there are a lot of quote, middle level technologists who are very worried about what's going on, who are contesting it, who have other ideas and so forth, who are stymied in the systems of Silicon Valley and similar places. But it's also the case that a lot have bought into voluntary myopias. So again, it's not just neutral. I think that Funmi's exactly right, that the apolitical thing is in part an adoption of something that works for, a view of the world that works for people. Hey, it's not my problem, is in fact, you know, a choice of a way of looking at the world. The ignorance and distraction of the politicians is crucial in this. So both points, I think they're both right. The politician, very, very, very few politicians, particularly in this country, but in most, actually know enough about the technology to be able to even have an informed debate about it. They are distracted by a variety of short-term things, including some of the social media and other spin-offs of the technology, but not only that. Don't forget China, I will just say that, just don't forget China. It's part of this, it's big, it's actually very powerful technologically, it works different politically, and decisions are getting made about this that have implications here and elsewhere. So it's not that. I wanted to come back to digital colonialism though with a partial, not a complaint, but a partial alternative thought. So yes, digital colonialism, but, and here's the but part, the analogy to colonialism is problematic, it seems to me, in certain ways, or it needs to be deepened, one or the other. So there's not just a colonial power, America is the digital colonizer of Africa, because there are a complex range of relations going on there, and again, don't forget China, but more, there's a risk here of problematic understanding of colonialism. Colonialism as political subjugation, say for African countries and many others, was also induction into capitalism. And induction into capitalism as an asymmetric system that wasn't simply run by Britain and France, or now by US in a sense, because in fact we see the difficulties and limits of the states trying to rein in or manage global capitalism, the power of the corporations, like Google, which the US state has never even really tried to regulate, the EU has tried slightly. And corporations and investment of wealth have an impact that the term colonialism risks obscuring. Now, one can bring it back in and say that's what colonialism always was. It was the East India Company, not just the British government, it was that, right? And if one makes that clear, then colonialism's fine with me as a description of this. But what
You can't go with that. That is actually what colonialism is.
Yeah. Colonialism is not like the British project of people bringing democracy to India. It was the East India Company going to India.
Wait, it's not just a question of whether it's the British bringing democracy, whether good or bad intentions. It's a question that the politics and the economics are entwined, and to hear political subjugation as the dominant part of this, or to hear the colonialism is to see the national agents as the primary movers, unless you make very clear that you also see global capitalism and the introduction to that as something that is not reducible to the
Yeah, but just
just
just watch what Facebook tried to pull off in India.
Yes.
They say, okay, we're going to give
Facebook
you
basics, yeah.
Facebook basics, and we're going to give you this free internet only the only internet will be on Facebook.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
we
I
control
mean,
what websites we
Yeah,
see, we control all the
right.
content.
All
and
over the
information.
satellite-based internet access, sure.
Yeah.
Can I just, thank you. The thing I wanted to, one of the phrases I found useful occasionally and comes from sort of development studies is Jim Ferguson's phrase, the anti-politics machine, which is like how he wants to sort of like think about development processes that are so oriented towards what we can do now that they never inquire into why it is that things are the way they are. And I frequently think that design and design thinking as in particular coming to us from, well, especially the sort of the Stanford Computer Science Business School nexus has a very similar kind of property, right? That is both in its future orientation and in the way in which it sort of seduces people into thinking that they're fixing things. It sort of rules entirely out of court as a sort of starting position, the very idea that one could either inquire into the politics of the situation into which design is meant to be introduced, or recognize that indeed that's actually a process, the kind of process that you're engaged in. So it certainly does go to the heart of how it is that that certain kinds of sort of the technological solutionism operates. I would sort of distinguish that a little again from technologists per se, but I think it's right there in the notion of design and design thinking for sure.
And I think to some extent that was sort of Craig's point, right? That these are systems that have specific affordances. It's not really about the individual actors.
And that goes for the socio-technical systems, but also for development assistance, Jim Ferguson's original point. Yeah.
Okay, should we open up
Sure.
for questions?
Sure. I'm lucky enough to, spend a lot of time in the media sphere at the Annenberg School. And one time, Rupert Murdoch came and gave a speech, and he basically was crowing about, and this was at the height of Murdoch's power, that he had now gotten to the place where he had access to 110 million people on all his systems, Sky News, all his newspapers, everything. So Mark Zuckerberg wakes up every morning and has access to 2.4 billion people. So I would argue that there has never been a media baron, even though he's afraid to call himself that has as much reach as this person does. And so in that sense, something is new here. This is not just a continuation. No, that's very true. But, I kind of differ from Paul that algorithms are just kind of uncontrollable things. I think we've been proven time and time again, as Facebook is proud to announce, that they could change your mood if they change the algorithm. And they've done experiments to show that they can change your mood if they change the algorithm. So, and this week YouTube came out and showed that the algorithm was pushing everybody towards, Trumpian crazy news. So, these people have a lot more control than we think they do.
So let me assert that Peter Thiel is wrong very directly, but it requires reminding us what the quote was. It's that I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. And he's wrong, right? If it were capitalism and democracy,
might not be
which was what Jonathan showed us, he might be right, but just making the wrong choice about which one to defend, which seems to me entirely possible. To the very quick points, this co-constitution of colonial capitalist, as you put it, David, it seems to me is a very good way to think about this when it's on the table, but that the danger, in a way, is that we exaggerate in most modern thinking the separation of politics and economics, that we buy into the idea that these are clearly and automatically separate spheres in which economics can potentially be self-regulating in a Smithian sense, and therefore who makes the decisions doesn't matter, but it turns out it does matter, in that the copyright payment wasn't to Reagan, I'll fill in a bit more of the story, it's to an investor who bought from the Reagan campaign as an investment the right to this and held it and made money on it.
So, actually, I just want to speak to that briefly before we move on, which is this idea of sort of colonialism and this idea of separating out democracy and capitalism. So further, Jonathan, to your graphs of inequality and the idea that the way to make real fortunes these days is in technology, I'm going to ask a question of my esteemed colleagues at this panel, which is that all 5 of the companies that are the stacks, to use Bruce Sterling and Benjamin Brown, who I associate with that, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, all 5 of them began in the United States. They didn't belong, so if this is a property of techno-rationalism per se, why is it that they all began in the United States? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm just going to I mean, I have some thoughts, but I know that all of you will actually have good thoughts
it's
on
worth
this.
noting.
So not only the United States, they all
Right.
began for the most part in Silicon Valley.
Right.
Very, very small.
Right, in the
regions.
North.
And
Yeah,
and
there's no
overwhelmingly in the 1970s on the
Right.
basis of commercializing publicly available technologies.
And that ties in with your thing about looking at when the inequality started. to vary.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, on the very first chart I had, I did put the original ARPANET design, which Vince had thrown on the back of it. I mean, let's remember, the government paid for the underlying thing. And these guys just understood, wait, here's a resource we can cannibalize. And by the way, I think their greatest insight was that the internet could be a winner-takes-all business. That you wouldn't need a second e-commerce giant once you had one
clarify
that
that,
was everything store.
It's that the internet would be a winners-takes-all business under the regulatory regime or lack of regulatory regime in the United States.
regulatory
That would
regime.
allow
Right.
several
Yeah.
different
Right.
winner-take-all
And so that
businesses.
ties in with the the Declaration of Right to Cyberspace, right? This explicit, like, keep your hands off the internet
Yeah.
position, right? That allowed that to happen and allowed that to happen specifically in the United States.
And John Perry regretted that in the end.
I know he's been sort of complicated things about that. Yeah.
Can I say one more thing to David's original point, right, with respect to sort of technological rationality and you know, it's I think what I want to point to is its movements. Technological rationality, as Craig would point out, this really predates our current data-driven moment. But the interesting thing in the data-driven moment is where data comes from and what data's role is with respect to that kind of rationality. And so the interesting thing then is because the data is generated by and large in our encounters with a variety of commercial entities. I'm doing one of my students has been doing some research for the last couple of years with the city of LA and the data team in the city of LA are managing a whole variety of different forms of sort of data-driven governance and civic engagement. And one of the questions that we're occasionally asked is, aren't corporations coming and trying to buy up the city's data in order to monetize it? And the depressing thing is the situation appears to be the opposite, which is that the city doesn't always have data about how the city operates and has to buy it from somebody else. If the city wants to know where the fire hydrants are, it turns out you have to go and buy that data from a commercial vendor. And so it's how those things move around in the sphere of data is, I think, that's the transformation to the sort of practices of technological rationality.
So one question, but before that I want us to throw out on the table this question of information. And the value of information is one that I don't want us to lose attention of, because I think information today has so much value. And who controls, one of the reasons Facebook is so powerful, for instance, and Google, is not just that they control advertising, via the ecosystem they created, they have access to unparalleled information about
Not just
people.
access, control.
Control.
Proprietary
And the thing
control.
is, if you think there's no regulation here, go to a place like Africa where people generally assert that Facebook and Google know more about citizens in Africa than governments do. Way more. So this is a big.
Why do you think the NSA went to Google when it wanted to spy on all Americans?
Because they know who has the dough, right? So go ahead.
I'm going to make the argument that there is not a market solution to this problem.
Antitrust?
That there's not going to be a competitor to Google that will level the playing field. That there is not going to be a competitor to Amazon that will level the playing field. There is not going to be a competitor to Facebook, and if there is, they will try and buy them, which they want the last two competitors.
Doesn't that suggest that antitrust could be a potential way?
So
to
I'm
get out
saying
of
that antitrust is the way. Look, this is not new. Remember, as Professor Willens has told us, in the last industrial revolution in the 1880s, 1890s, people like Rockefeller and Morgan and everything got too big and took over everything. And we had a whole progressive era in the beginning of the 20th century.
Catch. So I agree, antitrust, I agree with that. I agree with the Shongwens analog to Rockefellers. The catch is that was not an era in which doing this through nation states was being questioned as much as it is today. Now, I think we probably need to do it through nation states, but what we're saying is political legal mechanisms are needed. It won't be market, I think we agree. And where do those political mechanisms come from? A reason to think in terms of a responsible nation state is that they aren't going to come from a sort of vague ethical global cosmopolitanism, which doesn't have any ability to do that antitrust work. It's going to depend on some established government or quasi-government like the EU to do it. So nation states still really matter if we want to contest the incredible power of techno-capitalism.
Yeah, but I was just in Copenhagen last week, and I met Ms. Vestager, who is the European Competition Commissioner. And she is very happy to say that she's going to take on these companies till they squeal. You know, I mean, she's.
And the EU is the only Western political authority that has done anything. As Canada has done a little and tried, just but anyway, in the new Justin.
But the whole
Trudeau
point of it is
regime.
that you actually need to be
But
transnational.
and so here's the catch, right? You need, and EU is a compartment. You need to be somewhat global, as it were. And this isn't something where the UN has a little office that's supposedly going to do this, but it's not going to, right? And so nations and treaties among nations and relations among nations matter in this. So we have at the moment, along with the libertarian ideology, which has been disempowering in one sense, we have also turned our back on the nation states as vehicles of democracy in too much of our thinking, and imagined that there is a time to move beyond the nation state here, rather than to have better relations among the nation states to successfully accomplish some of this regulation.
And can I add in sort of an infrastructural component to this as well? So I was pointing a little to some of the things like, for instance, the ICANN stuff, but I think one can also sort of read it on a slightly different level. So we're all familiar with the creation myth of the internet and sort of notions of a decentralized network that would have no central points and be immune to attack. The network that was indeed a network that existed in about 1973. The network that we have now is an incredibly centralized network in which there are 15 companies, all international companies, many of them actually not originally based in the United States, which is also kind of fascinating, who are the tier 1 network providers across whose wires pretty much absolutely everything flows, and with whom one must parlay if one intends to be participating in internet activities in any kind of way. So yeah, this stuff, I mean, absolutely there's a critically important role for nation states, but it exceeds the nation state in every kind of, in every, and so, it applies not only to the, who we normally think of as, the big five or whoever, but also to the critical infrastructural role played by a whole bunch of players who we are not by and large attending to.
There's two sides to this, one of which is the kind of Brandeis argument, which is that if Facebook had to compete with Instagram and WhatsApp, one of them might offer you a service that was less invasive, less, doing those things. So that's one argument. But that still doesn't deal with this larger issue, which is, as Craig pointed out, things like artificial intelligence in weapon making are coming. And nobody is talking about it at a political level. I mean, Elon Musk is occasionally saying, look, this is really serious, guys. And Bill Gates is occasionally saying, look, we're going to put millions of people out of work and we don't have any clue what to do with them. And Mark Zuckerberg says, oh, we'll have universal basic income. Does anyone in this room think that the Republicans would pass universal basic income?
And would it solve the problems if they did?
No.
Well,
But
so
it
would be
would,
starving
it
on those
would
people.
not solve
the
all of the
savings.
problems.
So I would direct everybody towards a guy named Tristan Harris, who has a website called Time Well Spent, and he was a Google design ethicist, if you can wrap your head around that. And he came to the conclusion that everything that Google was doing was to addict young children. And so the time that I've spent with him and with a bunch of what I would call dissident engineers has saying, look, we have to get these companies to stop doing it. I put up this book, which is about how to build addictive apps. And it really, what it is the Skinner box, right? And the idea is that if I send you something and then you get a like, you're gonna check back to see how many likes you got, just like the mouse keeps clicking the bar. You don't get a like every time you click the bar. And so then you get addicted to clicking the bar, right? And you get addicted to checking back with Facebook once every 20 minutes to see how many likes you got. So they had two just pieces of practical advice if you have kids. Do never let them take their phone into their bedroom at night. And if you read the New York Times Sunday Magazine piece on porn, on online porn, and how all children are learning about sex through porn, that's where it happens. So that's the first thing. The second thing is teach them that meals are not a place where you can have your phone, ever. And those two things, and the third thing they said was have a day where everybody in the whole family is off the internet and has to just talk to each other as humans.
Not what a pain it is to not be able to
but look, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because clearly when Facebook puts out a service to get 5-year-olds on their service, it's called Facebook Messenger. Supposedly it's so parents can keep track of their kids, but what it's doing is addicting kids to Facebook at the age of 5.
So I actually agree, but want to go beyond what Jonathan just said, and Tristan Harris. So Tristan is great, and yes, you should look at Tristan Harris. You should look at Debbie for a reason that I'm going to stress. And you should have doubts that ethics will be enough. And this is the comment on Tristan, who I think is a terrific guy. But he's an ethical analyst of some things people as individuals might do differently based on their ethics in relation to the technology, which does not get at the whole production of the technology and everything. I mean, so ethics is important, but not enough. The criticism of the technology from outside won't be enough. Deeply social perspectives in the technology and in the development of the technology will be crucial. This is my pointing to Debbie moment. That is, it's got to happen in a way that gets inside this, that is not standing outside and criticizing only. Regulation will be important, but not sufficient. Back to that. Investment to secure public goods will be crucial in all of this. We still have to really invest to get the public goods. We can't just regulate and expect private industry to deliver them all on a profit basis. And politics is essential. Rescue politics from being a dirty word. There has to be a real politics, or this all isn't going to work. That's the other side to ethics is not enough.
The one thing I'd like to add, I agree with everything that my distinguished colleagues have said. I do want us to be careful about the language we use and the way in which we think about these things. I'm actually not, I find myself personally uncomfortable with the language of addiction with respect to social media, mainly actually on the basis of what I've read about, if any of you have ever read like Natasha Dowshow's work on the design of video game machines, if you want to see what the design of a specifically neurophysiologically addictive loop looks like, she has some amazing things to teach us. And I want to be, careful too about how we have a habit of classing all kinds of behaviors or interactions with devices as if they were exactly the same thing. Rather as though saying we're all sitting here, desperately interacting continually with our chairs. And it's like I'm continually in contact with my chair, but that's not my interactions with you guys. And so similarly, I think one can distinguish between Candy Crush, Facebook likes, and other kinds of things that people do. That's not to take away from any of the excellent recommendations, but I think we have one of the things. This stuff has come up so fast that we don't have a sophisticated language for talking about what's going on. And I think the first thing we need to do, or I think something we need to do with urgency, is develop a more sophisticated language for talking about that.
Kathy, we're all looking to you to make a comment on this.
I was going to say, the two things I think about is Quinn Norden, actually, who's a tech journalist, has written about this idea of interacting with the screens. And I personally get annoyed at this idea of, like, oh, these days everyone is looking at their computers on the subway and nobody's interacting with each other. And I have to say, first of all, for most women who live in major cities, I want to not interact with other people on the subway. I want to not have other people try to interact with me on the subway. But the other thing, of course, is this idea of, like, yes, there's addictive behaviors, but there's also, like, I'm learning Spanish, I'm reading a novel, I'm talking to my family across the world, all these other things. So that's the piece. So Quinn's talked about this. She says, basically someone using the internet is just, it all looks like someone's typing. They're doing their taxes, they're writing a love letter. It all just looks like they're typing, right? Someone on their phone from the outside basically all looks the same. While we're throwing out recommendations for parents, I'd also send out a Word to Data Board's book, It's Complicated, which is more aimed towards adolescents, but it's a more nuanced understanding of thinking about adolescents on the internet. Right, and he would be the first to say. I mean, and now I feel like it's like this is the bingo card, right? This is a very meta use of this, right? That the quote that he always gets is, "The future is here; it's just not already distributed." And of course, that's also true for dystopias, right? I mean, so he writes these books, and everyone's like, "Oh, you write these books that are dystopias," and it's like, many people on planet Earth would really like to live in these worlds, right? They're not dystopias, and it's like, and there's lots of places in the world where the stuff that we take for granted. As either like the stuff that we just treat as regular life, not having it what makes it dystopic. And as I said, one of the things for me is following Puerto Rico pretty closely over the last 4 months, and there's no way you would describe that as dystopic. And it's not that, oh, there's these horrible like companies oppressing them and there's like this cyberpunk future. It's like they don't have clean water, they don't have electricity. Right? So dystopia comes in many forms and it comes in many places.
And Jeff, you would not describe China as a dystopia. You would say there are a lot of problems and a lot of issues, but you would recognize some of the same things in this story that actually there are reasons people buy into a lot of this too.
I have a dystopian story about China now. Alibaba has produced an application called Sesame Social Credit. So what it does is it takes your credit score, how well you repay your bank card, and it overlays it a artificial intelligence mediated everything that you do online and offline. So if Amy crossed the street in the middle of the block in Shanghai and got caught on one of those ubiquitous CCTV cameras, her social credit score will go down. Craig, if you wrote something on WeChat that was critical of the Chinese government, your social credit score would go down.
This has happened.
So you'd say, okay, why would anybody be on this service? There are 205 million people on Sesame Social Credit, and Xi Jinping suggested that everybody in the country should be on the service. The bizarre thing for me is my students have told me that the young men of millennial age put their social credit score on their dating apps to prove that they're good, patriotic citizens worthy of being married and won't get in trouble.
And just a footnote, so yeah, really important, along with facial recognition and everything else. It doesn't just happen by this affiliate, whatever it is, Ant Systems, the affiliate of Alibaba, right? So it's not like that just happens and then they use it. It's actually directly something the government has sought to have happen and engaged to make sure it happened and developed white papers about and all of this sort of thing.
My point was just this is converging, and you have Facebook desperate to get into China, and you have Tim Cook helping to support it, and you have Xi Jinping going to Davos and being celebrated, and it's a plea for if you take all this stuff seriously, then you need to get serious about politics,
Yes.
get serious about thinking about new forms of regulation,
Totally.
try to figure out how to get these parts
But
of
let
it
me-
that we all want around the world more, but also be
Yeah.
afraid.
I completely agree, and on the side of fear or something, what I wanted to call attention to is not something good, though I think we have to recognize that the ability to deliver some kinds of goods is what gets people to buy into systems that also don't deliver other kinds of goods. But in this case, the seduction of the idea that, hey, actually China is able to be more effective than we are. So in large parts of the empowered political discourse, or corporate discourse in the US, in these corridors of wealth, in Forbes magazine, there is a discussion along the lines of democracy is in trouble because it's too chaotic and inefficient and not able to deliver the goods. China actually works pretty well. The government can deliver the goods. Those neo-Confucian communists run against corruption, and they're effective in delivery, and they're going to take over biotech, and they're going to take over AI, and we had better be more like them. And the first thing to do is get rid of politics, really. I mean, and I think that's part of the danger.
Right.
And as always, the question is delivering what goods and for whom?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think
Final
you're,
responses. Yeah. Final.
I think you're totally right, but I also say that the smartphone is in your pocket everywhere you go, and it's pinging you. And as Sean Parker, was the first president of Facebook, said, we figured out how to give you a little hit of dopamine every 7 minutes, and that was the whole idea of constructing the ping, ping. Okay, this thing's out here and it's pinging. How long can you wait till you actually look at it after it's been
And
pinging?
then when you look at it, how beautiful it is. It's not like it's some
Right.
print page.
Right.
I was just going to say very quickly, and this is in my capacity as the UCI speaker on the panel. I'll point you to the work of Mimi Ito, who has written very cogently about some of these issues, sort of trying to sort of see the concerns from all sides. She's at the Center for Connected Learning here has published some work on this publicly quite recently, and I think there might be some useful resources there for people concerned with some of those questions.
Oh, okay. So I was gonna say, your question was, so like, we've laid out the problem, what we can do, and pretty much all of the answers are in the shape of, we need to reorient our political system, right? There's a midterm elections in 8 months, right? I don't know, I mean, I assume that California is the same as many other places where there are many people running who have not run before because they feel that their values are not being expressed in the political system. I certainly have a wish list of things that I want anyone I vote for to offer. It seems a lot more likely that this year people will offer those things. So, and the way I sort of see it is getting involved in not just politics, but getting involved in civic actions at all levels that you have access to is really the only way that we're going to change this. And fortunately, so I mean, I alternate between days where I'm just kind of like, basically we're doomed, that the people who have control are willing to take the rest of the country down to get an extra X million dollars, an extra so many years of their lifestyle, and the rest of the world go down. 2 days where I'm like, there are a whole lot of people who are basically standing up and saying, we're not going to let this happen. So one way or another, it will be stopped from happening. So, and so, I mean, so I don't know which of those two scenarios is true. And I know that nihilism and despair is the lazy way out. And the other thing to do is the other side, which is just work like hell for the future that you want to live in.
Okay, so we are out of time. Do you final?
Well, if we're out of time, we're out of time. Let's just end it.
Great again.